Oh, there we go. Okay. So as I mentioned, we'll be talking about some of the research that Save the Redwoods League has been supporting, our redwoods and climate change research. And this has been primarily done by our scientists that we support at Cal Poly Humboldt. And that is Steve Sillett, Bob Van Pelt, Allison Carroll, and Marie Antoine. So, you know, some of this is just kind of for some background, but, you know, people really started just going into the canopy of Coast Redwoods in the 90s. And so it wasn't that long ago. And that was primarily by Professor Steve Sillett. And when they first started going up into the canopy, into the crowns of these trees, they were really just looking at what is growing up there, right? So different animals, different plants, lichen, all of that stuff. And very early on, they realized, you know, instead of focusing on what is growing on the trees, we really need to start thinking about the trees themselves and how they are growing. Because what we were able to do was take a snapshot in time of how these trees were growing. But what scientists really wanted to look at is how are they growing over a long period of time? And how did they grow in the past? And of course, looking at growth in the past can help us think about growth in the future. And so, of course, climate change, when we started this in around 2009, I mean, climate change obviously is big, but it was especially starting to get really big during that time. And so we launched this big initiative, the Redwoods and Climate Change, to really think about, okay, how are these iconic species responding to the changes in climate that we are experiencing? I mean, we know from the history of redwoods, they've been around for so long that they have experienced changes in climate, dramatic changes in climate over, you know, hundreds of thousands and millions of years. But what is going on right now? How are they responding to that compared to in the past? So we've had so far 3 phases of redwoods and climate change. And you probably are most familiar, at least, or I'm sure I've given a talk before about phase 1, right? So phase 1 and 2 started in, or phase 1 started in 2009, and it was plot-based. And I'll show you a map, but our scientists set up 1 hectare plots, and it was only in old growth redwood forests. Now, they've done this research in coast redwood and giant sequoia forests, and I'm just going to be talking about our coast redwood forests tonight. So our first phase is just old growth. It started in 2009 and it was plot-based, right? Because we figured we want to know what's going on with the cream of the crop, the old growth redwood forests. And so the closest plot, I'm sure that you know to you all, is at Big Basin. And then there are some north and there are some south. In phase 2, our scientists remeasured, it was about 5 years later, 5 to 10 years later, all of those plots and did some more research on those. And then in phase 3, which was started in 2017, it was tree-based. So no longer are we looking at a whole plot of land, but we're looking at individual trees. And we really focused on not only old growth, but second growth forests and throughout the range. So in a bunch of different types of forests, all throughout from the Oregon border down to the Big Sur area. So I'm going to start off just by giving a summary about kind of phase 1 and phase 2. So for phase 1, what we were really looking, these are some of the questions our scientists were trying to answer. 1, what factors are influencing tree growth, right? How are the redwoods responding to a changing climate? And 3, how are redwoods performing across their range? So those were kind of 3 main focus questions for phase 1. So what's so cool about coast redwoods, it makes them really, really great to be able to study, is that they have such graphic range, right? So you can find them from the Oregon border down to about Big Sur. And from a precipitation standpoint, the amount of rainfall that happens during that geographic area is huge. And you can see that from this map on the, or this chart on the right-hand side. In our southernmost plots, down here in the Big Sur area, the annual precipitation is low, right? And then our most northern plots, north of Humboldt, they're actually in a temperate rainforest. So they get quite a bit of precipitation. And so we have redwoods that are able to survive this huge range. And so by studying them across this whole range, we can really get an idea of how they're responding to these changes in climate, because obviously it's going to be very different what is going to be impacting them in the southern part of the range versus in the northern part of the range. Okay, so some of the criteria for some of the decision on where they decided to do their or set up their sites, I guess I should say, specifically for phase 3, was they picked, remember, this was tree-based, right? So we no longer have plot-based, but we have tree-based. So some of the things is the trees had to exceed 60 meters tall. And we'll talk at the very end why that is, but they had that kind of threshold. And they wanted to make sure to study trees that were protected for long-term study, right? So that means that they were in public ownership, so state parks, a national park, or it could be on private land, but that they were never going to be able to be cut. They did do some research on Save the Redwoods League land, so it had to be able to be protected for long term. And then in this phase 3 stage, they looked at about 235 trees at 45 locations. You can see some of them are primary forest, which is old growth. Some are secondary forests, and some were from previous studies that they had data on. So the graphs on the left-hand side just show the distribution of the Coast Redwood Forest. You don't have to look at the numbers, but it just shows you where all the different individual sites are that they studied. So what they were really trying to get at is looking across a huge range. So high elevation, low elevation, really far east, really far north, really far south, really dry, really wet. So they wanted to pick sites that had all of these different characteristics so that they could get a really good comprehensive picture of how the Coast Redwoods are growing. So for the phase 1, which, like I said, most of you are probably somewhat familiar with, what did our scientists do? Well, these were the plot-based studies. And so they climbed the trees, right? And they did tree measurements so that they could get the height of trees, so that they could get the diameter of trees, so they could look at number of leaves that are growing on these trees, so they could really get at the biomass, how much wood is in these trees, so that they could also look at carbon. That was a huge factor, right? Is how much carbon these trees are producing. Excuse me. They also took tree cores. So I'm sure you all are probably familiar with this, but it's where you take this instrument and you can bore into the tree and you get out a very thin pencil size strip of wood. And so our scientists will do that at multiple locations going up a tree. And through this, they can look at these tree rings. And so they can see the growth of the trees. And often people ask, well, does it harm the tree? And what I have been told is it's kind of like a pinprick, right? So the Coast Redwoods will heal it over pretty quickly, but they do start at a certain height, and they don't go below a certain height because that can damage the tree. So I think they start maybe 5 meters up is where they will start coring, and then they will continue to core up further. And so one of the things that came out of doing and looking at all of these tree rings, besides being able to look at the growth of the trees, is we were able to put together this comprehensive tree ring record for the Coast Redwood, which had never been done before. And it's kind of like, you could think of it as a blueprint, right? And so it helps to be able to now identify and look at other trees and kind of slide them in and say, oh, okay, this is how they're growing. This is what year they're growing. And look at their growth over a period of time. So this is one of the first graphs of many that I will show you all. And this is just one of the things that we were able to discover out of some of this research. Now, these are the tree rings chronologies. And so what the lines are basically just over time, it's summed up for a location, the growth of the trees. So if you see spikes going up, it means the trees were growing a bunch that year. And if you see spikes going down, it means the trees were not growing as much that year. And from top to bottom is just our different plots north to south. So JS is Jedediah Smith, PC is Prairie Creek, RNSP, Redwood National State Park, Humboldt Redwoods, Montgomery Woods, Samuel P. Taylor, BB is Big Basin, and then LH is Landis Hill, our furthest southern site. And so I'm just gonna draw your attention to two dates. The 1924 date, if you look at all of the black lines, you'll see that they kind of are going down, a downwards V, which means the trees were not growing that much that year. And if you go back and look at records, you'll see that that was actually a drought year. And so there's news clippings that talk about how there was not that much water that year. So the lack of water was impacting the growth of the trees. And then if you look at 1983, you can see a lot of those lines point up. And that was actually an El Nino year. Many of you may remember that there was a lot of flooding that happened. And so the trees were growing a lot that year. And so one of the things that's cool about this is we can see a pattern across the redwood range, right? We can see that from the north to the south in 1924, all the trees were reacting the same way, or all the forests. And so that tells you that they're responding to a change in the climate that was happening. It's not just a very localized thing that happened at that site. And the same with 1983. And so that's one of the things that our research has been able to do, is look at these patterns over time. Here is another example of looking specifically at the tree growth. Now, this is one tree. I believe, I'm not sure exactly where it is, somewhere up north. There's a 3D image of the tree on the right. And this is the growth of the tree over 500 years, right? And so the blue line is just some years it grew a lot, and some years it grew not as much. This tells you how much it grew. And so one thing you may notice is from 1900 to 2000, how do you see the growth of the tree? Well, it's going up. And so you can see it's very variable from year to year, but in the last 100 years, those blue lines are growing a lot. And so that's one of the big things that our scientists found, is that in these old growth redwood forests, in the past century, the trees are growing a ton. Now, why is that? Well, they can make speculations that it could be because of climate change, that there happens to be a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. And what do trees like to do? They like to take that carbon out of the atmosphere, and they like to turn it into sugars, and they like to grow more wood. And so there could also be because there's more sunny days, and on those sunny days, they will photosynthesize more, and then they will also make more wood. So this is one thing that we have actually seen, is that this, what we call this 20th century growth spurt in especially old growth redwood forests, most likely due to the changes in climate that are happening. And this is one of the fastest growing trees, because they remeasured, like I said, They measured all these trees and these plots. And then 5 years later, they did remeasurement. So they were able to see how much these trees are actually growing. And so this is I'm going to give you some stats here. I have to make sure to, this is one of the fastest growing trees, and it is putting on about 5 pounds of wood a day. And so it grew a lot, about 870 kind of metric tons between 2009 and 2014. So these trees are really growing, especially the old growth trees are really growing a ton. Now, one of the other things, like I said, that our scientists did during this phase 1 and phase 2 is they wanted to look at biomass. And that is how much wood is there in the forest. And in order to look at biomass, or once you look at biomass, you can look at carbon. And so our scientist, Bob Van Pelt, he is this amazing artist and created this illustration, but he also created these plot maps, which is down below for each one of these scientific plots. And so what it shows is all the downed wood, the red and the yellow are the footprint of the trees. You can see some river going through there on the left-hand side, the blue. And it really gives you an idea of how much woody material there are in these forests. And this is, excuse me, this is Jedediah Smith. So this is actually one of our world record holders for the amount of biomass in our old growth Coast Redwood forest. And Coast Redwoods have so much biomass, not just because their trees are so incredibly big, but because of all these fallen logs that are on the ground. And we know redwoods decompose so slowly, so those logs stick around for a long, long period of time and hold that biomass and hold that carbon in there. So this tells you the amount of above ground dry mass for kind of the top 8 forests that we have, Coast Redwoods here. And so you can see that there's at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that are over 4,000 metric tons. And those are world record holders. So our old growth Coast Redwood forests have more biomass and store more carbon than any other forest on the whole planet. And they have such a small footprint, and yet they are doing a lot when it comes to carbon storage and when it comes to biomass. So that's kind of a big summary of what came out of phase 1 and phase 2. Remember, we just looked at old growth forests. The scientific studies were plot-based. So some of the things we found, which is all the stuff that you probably know and talk about, are that our tallest Coast Redwood tree is about 380 or so feet. The oldest known Coast Redwood is over 2,500 years old. That old growth store more carbon than any other forest on the planet. We now have these predictive equations for redwood growth. And old growth redwood trees are investing a lot of energy into creating heartwood. So one of the things, let me just go back really quickly. So one of the things that our scientists looked at is, you can see in this that there is the sapwood, which is the light white part, and then you can see the heartwood, which is the dark part. And what our scientists found is when they went back and cored 5 years later, they can compare those. And they were able to see how much heartwood the tree is investing in. So some of that sapwood eventually converts into heartwood. And so our scientists were able to see how much of it is converting into heartwood. And some of the really old growth, really big trees are actually converting quite a bit of their energy into heartwood. So they're growing less, So their tree rings may not be as big because they're not investing as much into new growth. They're investing more into converting that sapwood into heartwood, which is where all the carbon storage is for the tree. So that's something that is kind of interesting. Okay, phase 1 and 2. Phase 3. This is where, like I said, now we have a snapshot of how these old growth redwood forests are growing. They're amazing. They're growing a bunch in the last century with all the carbon and the sunlight. And they're storing all this carbon. But now the question is, so much of the redwood range is second growth forest, right? And so how are these second growth forests growing? How are the redwoods growing at high elevations or at the ranges? The far east or the far north. And so this is when, again, our scientists picked locations and they chose 5 trees per location to climb. So instead of looking at a whole plot, they just chose these 5 trees. And they were able to just do a few measurements by climbing these trees, and they're able to look at biomass and number of leaves and carbon and a bunch of other things. And so the questions going into this phase 3 were, are growth trends consistent across the range? So are we seeing the same type of growth no matter where you are in the redwood range? What is influencing the variation of ring width or growth? So similar to what, that was a similar type of question we had in phase 1. What is influencing the growth of these trees? How do forest type and latitude influence the growth response to hotter temperatures and drought? So does it depend on where you are in the range to depend on how you're responding? And also, what if factors may explain redwood growth in this 21st century? So I'm going to go through each of those and talk about what they found. So here's an example, again, an amazing illustration by Bob Van Pelt of a second growth forest. So I'm just going to go back really fast. Here is our old growth forest. And what do you notice, right? There is variation of tree height. The trees are bigger, and there's some understory plants that you can see down here versus this picture where all the trees are the same height. They are obviously very tall and skinny, and then there is a very thick canopy up there, and it doesn't allow probably for a lot of light to come in and not a lot of understory plants to be able to grow. And then if you look at the plot map that was established, there's not that much biomass either. So there's not as many fallen down logs in this second growth forest. So this is looking a little bit at the growth of the second growth versus old growth. So I'll walk you through these graphs. So first of all, just on the left-hand side is second growth forest. And the difference in color from blue and red is not all that important right now. It's just 2 different forest types. One that's Arcata Community Forest, which is wetter, and one actually in Oakland, near where I am here, that's a little bit drier. But A is looking at their height over depending on the tree age. And so what you can basically see is that fairly rapidly, these trees will grow pretty tall. So they're getting to be 60, almost 70 meters tall within 150 years, right? And that's like this. After a place has been clear cut, there's a ton of sunlight, And so these trees are just able to grow up really, really quickly, and very tall. But then they kind of plateau because of competition. And there's not as much sunlight, there's not as much space. And so then they kind of just get stuck at that 60 or 70 meter. If you go down to C, this is looking at above ground biomass. So they put on biomass a lot slower, right? So they shoot up in height, but then they don't have a lot of space to start to get big. And they're very, very crowded. And you need time to be able to put on that biomass. So within 150 years, you can see their biomass is maybe, 15 to 16 megagrams. Now, what our scientists did is superimposed the graphs on the left to the graphs on the right. And the green and the kind of yellowish color are old growth redwood forests. And so in B here, the top right, you can see that if you compare the second growth height to the old growth height, it's pretty up there, right? So you have a lot of old growth that are between the 70 to 90 meters. So our second growth grow really tall up to a similar height as old growth very quickly. But then if you look down here at D, the biomass is so small compared to our old growth redwood forest. You can almost not see. The only way you can see our second growth on this chart in D is because there's a little box around it. Hopefully you can see it right here. And again, it's because there's no space, right? And so our second growth have a ton of potential, but they just need time to be able to allow for them to put on that biomass. So here's a picture. So it shows that a second growth forest has probably about a third amount of biomass as an old growth forest. So there is a lot of potential. It is able, especially the fastest growing second growth, are able to put on that biomass, but they need some help. And that's one of the things that I'm not going to talk about it here today, but that's one of the things that Save the Redwoods League is doing is in our restoration work. We're trying to help restore these second growth forests to be the old growths of tomorrow by going in and doing some thinning and giving them the second growth forests the space to be able to start to grow bigger so they can start to put on that biomass and accumulate that carbon. So here is, oopsie, sorry. And this is getting at, I believe, hold on, let me just go back to that question. Okay. So this is getting a little bit at question 1. Are growth trends consistent across the range? So this is kind of a very busy graph, and I wouldn't worry too much about it. Again, this is looking at the growth efficiency of these different forests. And I should say it's looking at the forest by latitude. So 40 degrees and above is Humboldt. 40 degrees is about Humboldt County. So below 40 degrees is anything below Humboldt County. And so what our scientists did is they kind of looked at the growth of these trees and compared their growth to what you would expect from a baseline. So if these trees and forests were growing more than what you would expect, then you see a blue. And if they're growing less than what you would expect, then you see a red. And so what I really want to highlight, you can see actually there's a lot of blue here in the northern part above 40 degrees. And I think some of that is that growth surge that we were talking about that they saw in phase 1. but I'm gonna pull out just the parts that are circled. You can see Wheeler Creek, South Forest Smith, Angelo Reserve, Santa Lucia, and Villa Creek. Excuse me. And those all have reds. And that means that in those locations, the trees are growing less than what you would expect. And I'm just going to point out that these are all at the edge of the range. So either in the northern part or the very eastern part or the very southern part. And so that's kind of the take-home message with this, is that we are seeing that forests and trees in the edge part of the range are not growing as much as what you would expect them to be able to grow. So how are they? Oopsie. So how are they growing? They are a little bit more sensitive to drought due to limited water availability, increased temperatures, and more fires. And so you were seeing less growth than expected for tree size. And again, it's at those edges, and that's probably because of the drought and the limited water in the eastern part of the range, and especially in the southern part of the range. Okay, so this is getting at that next question, is are they responding the same across the range and depending on different latitudes and elevations? So again, I'll walk you through these graphs. On the left-hand side, we have second growth forests, and on the right, we have old growth forests. And so the top left, ACF, is Arcata Community Forest. So that's a second growth forest in Humboldt County that is very wet. And then below that, RRP is Redwood Regional Park. And that is here in Oakland, and it's a second growth forest that is very dry. So this is comparing a very wet second growth to a very dry second growth. And this is how much they're growing, so their growth trends. Their wood volume, how much wood they're putting on over this 100-year period from 1900 to 2000. You can see for the second growth forests, the blue means that they grew a lot more than what you would expect. And that makes sense, right? These forests were basically clear cut. There's all this sunlight. They're able to grow up really, really tall from basically nothing. And then, excuse me, and then they slow down a little bit. And so the red is where I said they get to be a certain height, and then they're competing for resources, so they kind of don't grow as much. And so then they start to kind of go back and forth, probably depending on the dynamic of the forest. But what I want to kind of point to are these two areas right here. So those dips in the red that you see is kind of the drought that was happening in, you know, like, what was it, 2015 or to 15, 17, that type of that area. And you can see they both started to put on less wood. But in the north, you can see the blue line started to go back up. And that's one of the things that our scientists found, is in wetter environments, especially up in the Humboldt County area, you saw in second growth forests more recovery after the drought than you did in the southern part of the range or in drier forests. The drier forest, it didn't look like it recovered back to normal after the drought. It's kind of on its way up there, but not as quickly as the wet in the north. And then in the old growth forest on the right-hand side, you have PR is Previne Ridge, I believe, which is a very high elevation old growth forest. And then SLP is Santa Lucia Preserve in the south. So it's also very dry. And so what you can see over here, you can see that there's a lot of fluctuation in the growth of the old growth forest. Some is going up, some is going down, but you can see, especially in the north, you can see that 20th century growth surge, which we talked about in the blue. And you don't quite see it as much in the southern part of the range. And then you see the drought down here in the Santa Lucia Preserve dipping down. So down at the southern part of the range, it was more impacted than to the drought than the north. You almost don't even see any change in the north in the old growth redwood forest due to the drought that happened, a few years back. So again, this goes back to that same idea that in drier environments, and especially those areas of at the edge of the range, they're seeing more of an impact of the drought and have more sensitivity to water, amount of water and the drought index than in some of other areas. So one of our third questions, what factors explain, or one of our last ones, the redwood 21st century. I don't have any good graph for this. I'm just going to tell you, it's when our scientists looked at all these different possibilities of what could be influencing the growth of these trees, they saw that it was the number of leaves, and it was also summer nighttime fog, which is very specific. So they were able to kind of pinpoint that. And part of that is because at night is when the trees start to recover their water loss. So the fog that happens, they're able to take in that water at nighttime, and then they're able to grow more cells. And then they use those cells then to put on wood during the day. So if they're not able to recover that water and to help replenish, then they're not able to grow as much wood during the day. And so it's really that nighttime fog, which we could be having less fog because of climate change, that is really influencing some of the growth of the trees in the 21st century. So that was kind of a lot there. But to summarize, for phase 3, the growth trends are not consistent across the redwood range, but that old growth forests seem to be responding well to some of the changes in climate. And so that we saw that, in the second growth forest, it really depended on whether it was a dry environment or a wet environment, and the elevation. Drought seems to have impacted most of those forests on the edges, north, east, and south, which we talked about. Over time, we're seeing an increased sensitivity to drought due to limited water, increased temperature, and fire. So we're seeing that these trees are becoming more and more sensitive to the amount of water compared to how they were in the past. And then the factors influencing the 21st growth are numbers of leaves and summer nighttime fog. So the last thing I wanted to talk about that our scientists talked about, which I find, this is something I find very fascinating. So we know one of the world record holders for biomass is Jed Smith, right? Jed Smith is just amazing for the amount of plants, the amount of trees, and the amount of ferns, everything. And I'm sure you all also know all about the crowns of redwoods. The canopy of the redwood trees are, especially up north, are unbelievable. They have these fern mats. It's their whole entire, it's like a whole entire ecosystem up there with lots of different plants and specific animals, all of that. But what was really interesting that our scientists found is here they're specifically looking at vascular plants. So vascular epiphytes, right? So epiphytes are those that are growing on other plants. And here they're just looking at vascular plants. So they're not looking at lichen, and they're not looking at moss. They're just looking at vascular plants. And if you look at the chart up here, the colors are not that important. That just tells you what type of plant it is. But you can see that the little chart on the right has absolutely nothing, and that's second growth forest. And then on the left-hand side, you see the majority of the plants are actually above that 40 degrees latitude, more or less. There are some vascular plants in the canopy below 40 degrees, but the majority of them are all above 40 degrees. And so our scientists knew that the canopies and the crowns up in Humboldt were always amazing. But until they really did this study and documented it, they didn't realize that these fern mats are very specific to those forests that are in Humboldt County and Del Norte County, and that you don't find any vascular plants in any second growth forests, which is so interesting. Like I said, there's a ton of lichen, and there could be a ton of moss and other types of plants, but not the vascular plants. And so it really makes those forests very, very unique up there, is the amount of that biodiversity they have up there in the crown. And, you know, I didn't hear necessarily a great explanation, except for it's probably water, right? If they're in this temperate rainforest, they have just a ton of water. And so they're able to grow all of these plants. And of course, you see things such as the wandering salamander, which are thought to live just up in the canopy and never even come down to the forest floor. Need that really moist environment of the fern mats. We have seen epiphytic coast redwood trees growing in the canopy of coast redwoods. So this is a picture of a coast redwood. So this was a seedling or a seed that dropped down and started growing up in the canopy. So it's not from sprouting. It's actually genetically different from a seed. Obviously, we see western hemlock trees growing up in the canopy. We see Douglas fir trees. Huckleberry is probably one of the most common vascular plants that we see up there. And a ton of ferns, right? Wood fern, and one of the most common ferns that we see up there is probably leather fern. So, one of the things that they're seeing all of these fern mats and this above 60 to 60 meters. So that's why at the very, very beginning, when they were thinking of criteria for trees, they said our trees have to be at least 60 meters. And it's because at that 60-meter mark is where they would start to see some of these vascular plants if they're going to grow in these environments. Hold on, sorry, I have to plug in my computer. It's going to, there we go. It's going to die. So, anyways, so with that, that is a lot of information. That's what I have for you tonight. I had to end it with a banana slug because, of course, who doesn't like banana slugs?